You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Greetings, listeners to Ronda Chervin's Radio Journal. This is Ronda, and this is part of the series I'm doing where I tell you about different books that I wrote that En route Books is distributing now. And this is one of this whole group where you can get the book for free if you're willing to pay the postage. But even if you never get the book, I want to tell you about this book of mine called Feminine, Free, and Faithful. And I consider it to be, in some ways, the most important and original book I've written, though it's not, the favorite of all time seems to be a book called The Kiss from the Cross, A Saint for Every Kind of Suffering, which was then republished under the title Avoiding Bitterness in Suffering with the Help of the Saints. But this one, Feminine, Free, and Faithful, is something I've been teaching for years in philosophy of woman classes. And it has a very interesting origin. Before Pope Benedict became Pope Benedict, when he was Cardinal, the head of Ignatius Press, Father Sessio, he studied with people like Ratzinger in Europe for his PhD in theology, and he was visiting Cardinal Ratzinger, then Cardinal Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict. He was visiting him in Rome and telling him about this press that he was starting, Ignatius Press. And Cardinal Ratzinger said, do you have any books about feminism, this movement that's growing, which is going to be very significant, and it needs critical thinking? And Father Sessio remembered that my manuscript was on his desk, and he said, yes, we are, and told him about the book. And so that's a lovely memory for me that that's part of how the book was published. So, it said it all, Feminine, Free, and Faithful. But to open that up, at the time I wrote it, which was the end of the 1970s, there was this split where many women thought if they were feminine, then they wouldn't be free in any way, and others thought if I want to be free, I can't be feminine. And I tried to show that fidelity, faithfulness to the Holy Spirit is what makes it possible to be feminine in a good way and free in a good way, and not feminine in a negative way or free in a negative way. So let me open that up for you. The book, again, is Feminine, Free, and Faithful. And, okay, so what is feminine in a positive sense? When you think of a woman who you think of as positive in a feminine sense, you're thinking usually that she's someone who is nurturing, warm, empathetic. Those are the three biggest qualities that we usually think of with a woman when we say she's feminine in a positive sense. But there's also a negative sense of feminine, which would be silly, overly dependent, self-pitying. There's all sorts of negative feminine images there. And then if you take the case of free, in the positive sense, we think of free as being someone who is strong and not under other people in a negative sense, that she doesn't feel free to express herself in any way because she's just trying to please men or conventions or things like that, or that she's a second-class citizen in some way. So the strong sense of being free would be being a strong person, a wise person, a leader type, that kind of thing. Okay, now, and so if you're faithful to the Holy Spirit, you can be feminine and free in this best sense. And we'll see that at the end of my little talk. When we think of Mary, Mother Mary, and the saints, we think of them as feminine in the positive sense. We certainly don't think of them as subordinate in the negative sense, like they were little nobodies because they were women. Think of Mary, St. Teresa of Avila, Catherine of Siena. They certainly weren't weak little characters. Okay, so now a big part of the book is going through theories about the relationship between women and men. And I go through the truths and falsehoods of these theories. And let's take feminism. And first of all, this word is used in a very wide sense, and many people don't realize there are many types of feminism. What I talk about in my book is moderate feminism, then there's radical feminism, and then there's pro-life feminism. And some people don't know about all these types. So what do we mean by feminism? The good definition of feminism would be those men, women and men who are against the oppression of women. Okay, now, the moderate feminist thinks of oppression of women as things like being beaten by men in certain groups, in certain times in Russia, for instance. Every time a peasant came in from the field at night, he would drink and then he would beat his wife. It was just part of his life. So, of course, everyone should be against that type of oppression of women. Okay, now, or it isn't really just that if a woman works at the same job as a man, which used to be the case, if a woman worked at the same job as a man, she would get half the salary. The reason kind of behind this, by the way, was that the man was considered was the breadwinner, and so if a woman was working, she was probably working, her salary was probably just part of the family income, and so it could be lower, that kind of idea. But just the same in contemporary society, that's simply unjust. Okay. However, what's called moderate feminism, or I would call moderate feminism, also includes this horrible idea that you should be able to abort babies because otherwise the woman is enslaved to her body. And since men, when they have sex, don't have to have babies, why should women have to have babies unless they want them? So this, even though it sounds, that would be mainline feminism, tends to think that way. Now, radical feminism goes much further. Radical feminists usually think that the way men have been enculturated is so terrible, we've got to stay away from them altogether. So, for instance, a radical Catholic feminist, some of them wouldn't say, we want women priests to say the present-day Mass, to celebrate the present-day Mass. We want to change the whole Mass from a feminist perspective. So they would take out any references to obedience of women to their husbands, or they would, want to call the Holy Spirit she and God the Mother and things like that. So that's even more radical. That's why I can, compare that to moderates wouldn't say that. Okay. So now, so you have these true aspects of feminism, which is that women shouldn't be oppressed, and then you have the negative thing of these extreme ideas, which are now, gone even more extreme since I wrote the book, which was in the 70s. Now even more extreme is the idea that you shouldn't even use the word she or he. Now then, an opposite theory to this is complementarity. And that's the theory that men and women were either created or just by nature to be different, and that their bodily differences should also be expressed are also expressed in the nature of their characters. And so you have two types of this complementarity as I analyze it. You have something called role complementarity, which is the idea that because we're different, men should be soldiers, women should be nurses. Men should be bosses, women should be helpers in the office, that kind of thing. And then you have, however, a different kind called quality complementarity, which would hold that when men and women really have different qualities built into their nature. However, these qualities make them good to be doing the same kind of job. So, for instance, the woman banker typically would ask the person coming in for a loan more about their family situation, their lifestyle, et cetera, She would be more personal, more warm and empathetic and nurturing to them, whereas the male banker would be more just objective. Here's the facts, that kind of thing. Okay, now, so there is also a third theory which is called wholeness theory. And this comes from the great psychoanalyst Carl Jung. And Carl Jung thought that the ideal is that women should have some masculine traits and men should have some feminine traits. And he calls this anima and animus. So the feminine traits would be a man should be nurturing as well as being strong. And then with masculine traits, a woman should be strong as well as being warm and empathetic, see? And in his therapy, he would try to help and his therapist, Jungian therapist, that's Jung, if you're not familiar with him. So this is called wholeness theory. And it has a lot of pluses to it because, in fact, it used to be complementarity theory was so taken for granted in most cultures that you would never see a man carrying a baby. Well, of course, the woman feeds the baby at her breast, so she carries the baby on her back, and whenever the baby cries, she turns the baby around and lets the baby suck. A man can't do that. But nowadays, with bottle feeding being at least, very widespread, even among cultures where breastfeeding has come back as an ideal, et cetera, we think it's nice that the father carries the baby around in the evening sometimes, and, et cetera. But we also think it's good to have women bankers, women politicians, women doctors, and so on and so forth. So there's something in that. On the other hand, the negative of the theory is that people get so caught up in this wholeness thing that they're no longer thinking in terms of their own feminine or masculine role as mothers and fathers, and therefore, if I've already had some babies, I've gotten in touch with my feminine side, the woman, by having these two babies. I don't need more. Now I need to get in touch with my masculine side by going out to work and contracepting or aborting any babies that might come along, that kind of thing. Okay, now, so much better than all of these is the Christian theory of male and female, and if we're faithful to that, we can have all of the best. Okay, so in the Christian theory, basically, we're created male or female. Male or female, he created them. And so this is God-given that we have different bodily functions. We have, different reproductive organs. We have, on the whole, men are more stronger, so they can do work that requires enormous strength better than women can, and women, of course, can nurture babies at their breast, and so on and so forth. So we're created that way. And then then there's the fall, where we get these negative traits after the fall, where women are weak sometimes, and men who be our leaders can be domineering and actually abusive, and so on and so forth, because they're stronger. And so, but in the redeemed relationship between men and women, all these traits are infused with love, and especially with God's grace. So if you look at women saints, especially take Mary, we see here she is, we picture her always as warm and nurturing, with baby Jesus held in her arms. And she's a very, very feminine figure. At the same time, if you look at her words, like the Magnificat, they're strong. My soul magnifies the Lord. All generations will call me blessed. That doesn't sound like some weak little sweet woman. And if we think of Teresa of Avila, the Inquisition was testing her, because at her time in Spain, there were all these heretical people rising up, and so the Inquisition was testing them. And after they talked to her for a while, they said, well, not only is she not a heretic, but she's a real strong man. Because she was so strong. And Catherine of Siena was telling one of the Pope who was you've got to go back to Rome, even if you'll be martyred. You have to go back to Rome, And one of my favorite images is Jesus would talk to Catherine at length, these long spiritual truths. And she was a third order Dominican, and here she had these priests of the Dominican order sitting at her feet, taking dictation from what Jesus was telling Catherine. So anyway, so that's my little, 15-minute summary of my whole book. Every one of my students who has read the book, who had to read the book, they all love the book, because it gives them a lot of insight into these basic underlying ideas which come up underlying the controversies that we have in our time. So, now, how do you get this book free? Okay, you go to www.rondachervin.com. It brings you into En route books, and my part of En route books, and which has all my titles. And right at the top, it says how you can arrange to pay for the postage and get the book free. And incidentally, I'm now retired, semi-retired. I teach one course nowadays online sometimes, and I do workshops, but I have a lot of time. Anyone who wants to write me an email and about anything, please feel free to do so. My email is on that same part of the web, of En route Books website. God bless you all, and may you be feminine, free, and faithful, or masculine, free, and loving. God bless you all. Bye.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, You're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.